Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Simon. It is the
Welcome
morning.
to another episode of the Impact Narrative.
Yes, the third in our epic
welcoming
series.
you here, but it's nice of you to come and visit me in my office.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's
You're always welcome.
that's lovely. I'm just yes. We should say something about what this is, shouldn't we? Because
So this is the Impact Narrative, the weekly overview of things that have gone on in the world. There's a lot that's gone on in the world. We're going to be selective, try and delve a bit deeper into the headlines, into some stories that we think are particularly important, have gained a lot of traction, and maybe even a non-story.
good. Well, we have our regular features, but yes, we're going from the global scale to the local. If there is
Indeed.
anything local, and maybe, in fact, some breaking news about the tide times for
Maybe, indeed.
Morecambe.
They're coming.
But yeah, well, let's hope that's something to look forward to.
So,
Anyway,
Mark,
Simon, well,
yes.
I think you've got a desire to talk about the situation in Syria, which maybe is escaping some people's notice at the moment.
Well, yeah, I think it's probably useful to maybe revisit events in Syria and just to take stock of it. What we're seeing now is that there's a round of talks taking place in Geneva, and this round of talks is hopefully going to bring about some kind of lasting resolution. It's the latest in a long series of diplomatic efforts to try and put an end to the Syrian crisis. But I thought that what it might be worth doing is maybe just taking stock of everything that's happened in the past 6 years, trying to untangle it a little bit and paint a slightly more easily digestible picture
Easily digestible.
of things that have been going on, because it's an incredibly complex set of issues that have all become intertwined, encapsulating protest and revolution, the emergence of Daesh, the renaissance of Al-Qaeda, US and Russia involvement, the Iranians and the Saudis, Hezbollah, lots of different actors all coming together with competing agendas. And I think that this is really complicated things for a lot of people. And so when we're hearing about Syria in the news, it's quite difficult to identify exactly what part of this Syrian crisis are we talking about. So I thought that might be a useful thing to try and do, maybe first of all, given that these talks are taking place in Geneva.
Well, this is a bit of a task in front of you, so you've got to summarise. It's a kind of a whistle-stop tour of the last 6 years.
Of events in Syria, yeah.
6 years in 10 minutes.
Something like that. So Mark, if at any point I start talking about something that doesn't entirely make sense, or you think that...
Stop there. No, go on. That was
we
a
need
joke.
to go in more depth, please shout up.
I'll try. On behalf of the of our faithful listeners and viewers.
Exactly. So I thought what I might do as well is make it slightly more interactive. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions.
All right.
To gauge your knowledge as a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion. Mark, what triggered this Syrian crisis?
Well, I guess it would date back to the Arab Spring.
It would.
Of 2011.
Indeed. Get that man a coconut.
Yeah, and this is a regime which was a lot more resilient, shall we say, than some others in the region, and therefore, instead of there being a rapid transition, there's been a very unpleasant and protracted slaughter.
Yeah, exactly. So I think to understand what's happening now, we have to go all the way back to the events of late 2010, early 2011, the self-immolation of a Tunisian street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, who was frustrated at the lack of economic opportunities, the lack of political involvement, and seemingly endemic corruption across Tunisia. And this ultimate act of agency, this expression of pure agency and frustration spread across the Middle East. It triggered a whole spate of protests, and these kicked off in Syria as well in 2011, where people took to the streets expressing their frustration, their anger, their resentment towards the Assad regime and all of those actors that were involved in supporting the regime. And I think that this took many by surprise, because Assad was seen to be relatively popular amongst people of Syria, amongst the Arabs. Obviously he'd had a long process of repression. He'd repressed huge numbers of people in Syria, but the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, was deemed to be quite pro-reform.
Right.
Relatively amiable, amicable with the West. So many thought that when people took to the streets that there would just be this sort of token process of reform to try and take the sting out of the protests. But I think that they were far more serious than that. They'd been triggered in part in Syria by environmental crises that had led to millions of people moving from rural environments to more urban environments, which put pressure on jobs, economic situation, institutions. So it was real sort of undercurrent of tension that was bubbling away. And instead of having this token set of reforms, the Assad regime just crushed it. It set out to crush the protest movements. And so that obviously triggered this longer, more intractable set of conflicts that have taken place that have really encapsulated all of Syria. There's drawn in a whole range of actors. But because of Syria's importance in the Middle East broadly, because it's really important for Iran, for Hezbollah, the Lebanese militia, the Party of God, that took on this existential geopolitical importance. And so the Iranians got involved trying to support Assad, Hezbollah got involved trying to support Assad, and opposition groups were increasingly framed along sectarian terms. Now, we've heard that a lot, this idea of sectarianism, right? So you must be relatively familiar with the concept of sectarianism.
Oh, yes, I've brushed against it from time to time.
I'm sure you have. So what would you take it to be, Mark?
Well, in this case, I mean, it's identity politics, I would guess, and the identity in this instance would largely be religious, but and that's where certainly in Northern Ireland, for example, sectarianism is another word for cultural, religious, ethnic divisions. Yeah,
and there have always been these divisions in Syria, but I think what happened after 2011 was that with a bit of manipulation, the Assad regime was able to cultivate deep, intractable, violent divisions between different communities. And he sought to boil this conflict down to an existential struggle between Sunni and Shi'i. Now that's not entirely accurate. There were individuals and groups that were sort of situated across this spectrum. But that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to boil it down to a struggle that the Assad regime was fighting against radical Sunni militant Islam, the likes of Al-Qaeda and what would later become Daesh. And it's from that struggle that Daesh started to emerge, again support from people who were marginalized by the Assad regime, who were victimized, who were struggling to find a sense of political space, find a voice, find protection. Daesh came along, obviously born out of events in Iraq as well, came along and gained credibility by providing that protection against the Assad regime and against a lot of other militias. So that started to happen. And I think that's when it really gained this regional and international focus. That people started to think about the Syrian conflict as a struggle against Daesh. But if I can just ask you, Mark, there was a big debate in Parliament in the summer of 2013? Yeah. What was that debate about?
Well, it was about the use of, the extension of existing operations in Iraq. British air operations, missions to Syria in order to attack the Assad regime, to stop Assad repressing his people.
Exactly.
I'm doing really well. This is like, I'm certainly
gonna
near
have a whole
100%.
basket of coconuts.
I'll have to do some cricket predictions in a minute. But anyway.
Staying well clear of those after last week's awful performance. But anyway, in 2013, that was the focus. The focus was on the Assad regime and stopping Assad from committing more atrocities. But that very quickly shifted in the coming year when the focus became more about Daesh, stopping ISIS from spreading, committing more atrocities. And that was how the conflict was framed. But since 2011, the conflict resulted in about 500,000 deaths. It's resulted in about 11 million people being displaced from their homes, 7 million internally, 4 million externally. It's fed into, obviously, the refugee crisis, but fed into instability in neighbouring states. And I think that many people view this crisis as a consequence of Daesh. But if we look at the data, we see that around 95% of those deaths have been a direct result of attacks by the Assad regime, attacks by government forces and their backers, the Iranians, the Russians, and Hezbollah. So I think that's really worth bearing in mind, which is why the British government, the Americans, and a lot of other international groups have said we cannot have a Syria moving forward with Assad in power. Now this makes sense, obviously, in terms of negotiation, in terms of actually building a future state, where you've got someone who has committed huge numbers of deaths, committed mass atrocity crimes against his own population, breaking the norms of the responsibility to protect, obviously, but also just committing serious crimes against humanity. But this is where it gets really complicated internationally. The Russians and the Iranians, they don't want to see Assad stepping down. Assad doesn't want to see Assad going, obviously. Even though he was an optometrist by trade.
Indeed.
He took the Hippocratic Oath. He was studying in London when his brother died, and he was parachuted into the Syrian Air Force.
He parachuted into the Air Force?
Into the Air Force, yeah.
Right.
So he
That's a reversal of the normal procedure in these
exactly.
matters.
So he could get a good quality rank, so he could then segue into the office of president with a bit of military credibility. But I think that's where we see the conflict is frozen at the international level because of the nature of the Security Council and UN politics. You have a really difficult issue that both the US and the Russians have this veto at the Security Council, and so any peace plan that puts forward a future of Syria that has Assad in power will get a US veto, and anything that doesn't have Assad in power will get a Russian veto. So you've got this frozen type of conflict, and then you've got all kinds of groups involved in the crisis, be it opposition groups who are desperate, who aren't united, be it the more violent Islamist groups, such as Al-Qaeda, such as Jabhat al-Nusra, Jabhat Fatah al-Sham now. They're not necessarily united. They're not recognised as legitimate opposition groups. So you've got all these different identities, all these different militias that are operating, not on the same page, can't agree about how to act against the Assad regime. So obviously can't agree about how to move forward in Syria. But at the same time, you've got civilians paying the ultimate price. People being killed on a daily basis. People being starved to death in places east of Damascus. So that's the situation that people in Geneva are facing, trying to figure out how on earth to get some kind of resolution to this crisis, stopping people from dying. In addition to that, of course, there's the widespread destruction of infrastructure, kids not being able to go to schools, hospitals being destroyed, roads, jobs, employment, food, education, employment, all destroyed. It's a country that's been destroyed. So it's not just about death and destruction, it's about the quality of life and being able to live life as well. So it's a really tragic situation that's just getting frozen by international diplomacy.
Pardon me.
So a nice cheery way to start the podcast.
Yes, well, and obviously these people can talk at Geneva, but in the end they're going to have to find some kind of solution. I think that some people have hoped for a long time that the conflict would be resolved by the victory of, basically, that Assad would win, there'd be a fait accompli, and then there'd be some reforms, maybe be back to square one.
Exactly.
But, you know, these various opposition groups are, again, resilient, and the fighting continues.
And part of the issue, of course, is building trust. How can you have negotiations with an actor who is responsible for killing friends, family, destroying cities, communities? It's difficult to build that trust, to take someone at face value for what they're saying. So I think actually having that dialogue, having those negotiations are really difficult, and building trust is an integral part of moving towards peace. So unfortunately it's a really tragic situation.
So, and what's your own solution, Simon?
Well, to be honest, I had a solution many moons ago.
Right.
A creative solution that I think would have worked, but I think that ship has sailed, unfortunately. So
there is no solution?
Not without some very creative diplomacy and getting people to compromise on their positions through exerting influence. But I think the real power holders, the real actors that can wield influence, are those slightly peripheral. The Russians, the Iranians, the Americans, trying to exert influence on those actors involved in the conflict. But even that, I think, is somewhat idealistic, and
And it's unlikely to end with the Zimbabwe scenario, with the dictator perhaps leaving for a different
Perhaps
destination.
not. Yeah, perhaps not. Especially when it looks like for Assad he's winning.
Yeah,
He's defeated Daesh. He's taking territory back from the rebels. He's taking it back yard by yard, it seems. But he's winning in his mind. So why should he negotiate?
So in fact the Russians and the Iranians, whatever, may well think that keep talking at Geneva to look as if they're open to different solutions, but they're hoping that while the talking goes on, Assad will present the fait accompli.
Exactly. It just improves his position, it increases his power, increases his negotiating position. So, incredibly frustrating and tragic position, and it's the people of Syria, of course, who are paying the ultimate price here. So, yeah, that's hopefully a bit of a broad brush overview of things to try and help people understand the intricacies of things a little bit more.
Yeah.
But I think we need to move on, Mark.
Right, we're going to talk about the royal wedding? No. So,
there is a non-story this week.
okay, yeah, well, the royal wedding.
Well, man marries woman.
Yeah, well, not yet.
Well,
no, I think
it's a woman.
It's one of the more marginally interesting royal wedding stories, I think.
Is it?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, the fact that she's not going to be princess, is she?
No, she's not.
The Mrs. Windsor to be is mixed race, American, divorced, lively, very intelligent, very independent minded,
very active,
I think,
in the charity world.
Yeah, if it weren't for the fact that one has an obligation not to be interested in these things, because obviously we operate at a much higher level than the popular press, but I'm quite interested in it.
Okay.
But only quite.
Okay. I think the one interesting thing has been, aside from what you're talking about with the future Mrs. Windsor and her character and her credentials as fundamentally a good human being, I think
seemingly so.
Seemingly.
Yeah, well, no, I think definitely so.
Is how the certain aspects of the press have covered this.
Oh, right.
And the Spectator published an article by one of their writers talking about the future Mrs. Windsor as the sort of woman the prince would have had as a mistress 70 years ago.
Right. How things have
just
deteriorated.
Indeed. Just
we're going to the dogs.
According to the Spectator.
But nowadays, the people that members of the royal family have as mistresses, they end up marrying anyway, don't they? So
apparently so.
Apparently so. No, it's all and of course she's converting to the Church of England, which means that she won't have to do any religious stuff ever again. So just go to church and keep up with her social media while I wonder if I'm not sure if that's
whilst following
banned.
the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Indeed, yeah, follow him, yeah, or like him or whatever. And you can always like this podcast and put,
of course, yeah, Mark is a big fan of people liking the podcast.
Well, I am, because I have no idea what it means at all. I think it means that you don't bother watching it, you just click like, and it makes it look as if you've... So it's really handy.
Excellent.
So, can I do a bit? I'm going to do a bit about Brexit, or are we going to do something more about cricket, or...
I did have something else to say.
Oh, God. Don't.
No.
It
was about immigration, actually.
Oh, well, fine. That should be
in
another
the sense that,
30 seconds.
That the future Mrs. Windsor...
Ah, right. We got to take back control.
Taken back
but
control.
No, she's not an EU person, so that's fine.
But what's interesting is that obviously she's not going to be subject to a number of...
but she's going to get rid of American nationality. She's going to become...
She will still be, or she should still be subjected to Home Office checks to make sure that the relationship is legitimate.
Are you trying to say they won't be rigorous in their checking? Because they usually are. The Home Office has a tremendous track record on such issues, and I don't want to let it slip.
I don't want to be the one to cast doubt on this, but normally there's a couple of years period where you have to demonstrate that the relationship is legitimate, where you have to show that you are truly, madly, deeply in love with one another, provide evidence of your relationship. So I wonder.
Well, a fast track, I mean, all she needs is to also be an athlete of world-class standing, and then she would have been made a British citizen at birth.
Of course.
So, yeah, I think you may be suggesting here that double standards are
No,
in play.
no, I
And that
definitely
won't
wouldn't do
do.
that,
It
no.
won't do on a glorious day for our country, because it seems that we've now disproved the scoffers and the carpers and the Ramonas, and there's a deal on the divorce bill, which is the ironic thing,
that's
that there's
wonderful.
marriages and divorces that are...
That is incredible, Mark.
Thank you.
A seamless segue.
Even I didn't realise it. Yeah, no,
Well,
you're right. Yeah,
carry
it
on,
was pretty
please.
seamless. There's no seam, unlike the pink cricket ball, which will be used at Adelaide, which will have a seam which apparently isn't as raised as the
Right, okay, so that
traditional ones.
may mean that...
But it does mean that I think this week we had an Alistair Cook prediction last time. I think this time Joseph Root will be out for 52.
Okay.
I think he'll. The thing is that this time, in his last innings, he was out the ball after he celebrated his 50,
Yeah, well,
and it all went to his head, and he suddenly thought, "Aha! I'm always out at some point between 50 and 100," and he was just trying to work out how many runs between 50 and 100 he would score, and he got all in a mess, and he was out the next ball. I think this time he'll score. He'll move on to 51 with a cover drive for 4, and then he'll score one more run, and he'll think, wow, at least I haven't been out the ball after my half century, and then he'll be out the next ball.
Thank you for that.
That's my prediction.
Moving on.
And that will be the only score over 50 on the England side in the first innings.
Right.
Alistair Cook will be out for naught, having wafted airily outside off stump to his 12th delivery.
Okay, 12th delivery. Right, you can write that down, remember that. But
Okay.
then he will save us in the second innings by dropping anchor and scoring a miserly...
6. Before wafting airily outside off stump.
I was trying to save it, Mark, trying to bring in some positivity. But anyway, we were talking about marriage and divorce.
Oh yeah, the Brexit. Well, yeah. Just very briefly. Let's see. We've got 34 years of British engagement with the EU to summarise in the next 15 seconds.
We have 8 minutes, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing about this, that the Leave campaign was presenting a case which said we're going to be free if we get out of the EU, and we're going to save lots and lots of cash if we get out of the EU.
Yep.
Now, for those who don't really know anything about the subject, that seems like rather a good deal. What they're now left with is an argument that it doesn't matter what the cost is, we'll be free from the EU. And I think that'll have detached quite a lot of people who bought their original argument and basically thought, well, I don't really care that much about sovereignty, but I do care about 350 million whatever a week. You know, in other words, the case presented by the Leavers used to be, for those who didn't really know much about it, a no-brainer.
Yeah.
It was obvious that if that argument was watertight, then there's only one way to vote. Well, now it's become obviously quite a lot more complicated, and I do think that some people who basically there will be some people. I've just heard Ian Duncan-Smith on the radio saying that it doesn't really matter what the cost is, that we're going to take back control. And he was arguing that ultimately we'll be better off, it doesn't really matter, 50 billion or whatever, we'll get that back because we won't be making contributions to the EU. Well, that rather presupposes, again, that there won't be any continual fee to be paid to the EU to be members of the single market, which is the way it does seem. It seems that there's going to be a deal which one would characterise as a soft Brexit, which I think probably will involve some kind of continual payment.
Yeah, certainly sounds like it.
But so again, you know, I would have thought this is another item of news which makes the referendum debate look tainted.
Yeah, certainly.
But then, you know, this podcast has no opinion on whether. Certainly, it doesn't want another referendum because it'll just be depressing again.
Well, I want to just press you on this issue about the argument that was put forward by the Leavers, the Brexiteers, if you will. Twofold. First was the take back control, the sovereignty argument, and we can maybe have a discussion about sovereignty another time. I think it's an interesting issue, an important global issue. But this figure, there was the second dimension that the UK would be better off economically for being outside of Europe, outside of the EU. This was a figure that was. Are you okay, Mark?
I'm just about all right. Yes.
Okay. Good. It's nearly time for a cigarette, so. It's okay.
Yeah, that's it. I'm nicotine deprived, but yeah.
So
well, the
this is a
figure. I mean,
that
and that was the thing that people kind of bite back against the idea that the 350 million was a cheap stunt. The fact is that if you give a figure, a concrete figure, then that makes headlines very easily, and that sticks in people's minds. And even if people then say that's the gross figure, the net figure is actually quite a bit less. The 350 million definitely was a masterstroke by the Leavers, if that's what you were.
Well, it was, but even at that time, when the bus was going around with 350 million on it, on the side of it, a lot of members of the press were pressing the prominent leaders. The press were pressing, yes, but they were pressing them as to the math behind this number, where it came from, and there seemed to be a real doubt about it even before the referendum took place.
Well, yeah, but I'm just, if you create a kind of a media buzz around a particular figure, it doesn't matter if under scrutiny that figure is shown to be inaccurate. The figure still works, and people
This is at the same time, before the referendum took
Yeah.
place.
Yeah, but again, people aren't really all that bothered about the detail. I think there was a figure which lent itself to headlines, and from that people thought, well, even if that isn't the right figure, it's still a very large amount of money. And that was all that mattered. That, as I say, what's happened now is that people will see a figure emerge, which is the bill we have to pay to cut ties, or whatever. And once a number is placed on that, you'll find that becomes an effective stick to beat the Leavers with. That people who still think that we should remain will be able to trot out 52 billion or whatever it is. And of course, the final figure will be north of that.
Sure.
Inexorably it will get bigger, and the time needed to pay it
So
off
what
will
sort of
get
numbers are we
longer.
talking about right now?
Well, at the moment, the people are saying about 50 billion. The opening gambit was less than 20 billion, and now it's crept up. And as I say, once you've gone over a certain limit, the money becomes kind of meaningless, because it's still, just like the 350 million, rather, that might not have been the real figure, but it's still a large amount of money when it's on a weekly or monthly basis. This is an eye-wateringly large amount of money, but it can be put in the context of NHS spending, whatever, and people will begin to just kind of take their eye off the actual, if an actual figure can be named, it'll be very effective. But in reality, the figure will probably creep up without anyone getting even more enraged than they already are. I think people are just taken aback by it and just thinking, well, it's either worth it as a price of freedom, or we've been had by the Leave campaign.
Sure. So just very quickly, as we're running out of time, and I know you've got a book that you want to talk about.
Yes.
But for anyone wanting to decide on their own terms whether they think that this is a good deal or not, what bit of advice would you give them?
That's a left field one.
It is a left field one.
Well, again, it's an emotional thing. Not as I say, if you think that the EU is a source of servitude, then any price is worth paying. We've been talking about the Syrian situation, and clearly in 2011 people risked their lives to get power back from the government. If you feel that strongly about the European Union, which some people do, well then name any price and it's worth it. So in the end, it's not a case of the people who will be affected by this will be the people, as I say, who actually cared about the financial argument in the referendum. And for those people, it's very hard to know what to do. You can calculate how much we're going to save, allegedly, against how much we're going to pay, but in the end, the final figure for what we're going to pay is something which can't yet be established. Okay. So all I would, in any case, we've just got to wait on, because there are obviously other things to the border with between the north and south of Ireland is just a horribly intractable thing. So this is only one step on a very, very tortuous path. Yeah. And so we've got I've got my book that I'm reading, and it's lost its dust jacket because I've been reading it.
Right.
And it's David Lawes' diary of the coalition government, which seems an awful long time ago now.
It certainly does.
But this is the period 2012 when he came back into the coalition to 2015, and it's a really good diary.
Excellent.
And it's Bite Back Publications, which publishes a lot of really good stuff of this kind, because its managing director, Ian Dale, blogger, whatever, is fascinated by diaries and contemporary political stuff. So I'd recommend it to all.
What's the little nuggets that you've taken out of this? Your favourite nugget?
Oh, well, there's loads of nuggets. Well, there's loads of stuff about Michael Gove, and the interesting thing is that David Lawes continues to be kind of torn on the subject of Michael Gove. He likes him one day and hates him the next, well, dislikes him the next, and he certainly feels that Michael Gove has got something to offer, but the reader of this book will draw a different conclusion.
Right.
And this is what I love about diaries. It's when it's unwitting testimony, as it were, when the author's trying to create a particular impression, but the impression created by the words is different from the one that the author wants to. And seriously, anyone who thinks that Michael Gove should be a senior minister, if this testimony is true, if the unwitting testimony is true, then what he's doing in senior political, because not only is he erratic, he's also spiteful. All these things are implied by this book, whether it's true or not. And it's just a mystery, really, why people, again, just like the Boris Johnson thing, people think that somebody with something different to offer deserves a place in senior political life, regardless of whether their judgment is good or not.
Okay. Well, on that note, Mark, I think we are out of time, but I think that's an interesting point to finish with in terms of the importance of perception and shaping narratives, and that covers kind of most of what we've been talking about today.
Yeah, it doesn't cover tide times, but I think perhaps we'll just have to leave. Should we predict? I think about 7:50 a.m.
Okay.
High tide.
I'll go 8:30.
Okay, let's see. I mean, we'll
go and have a look.
Don't tweet us or whatever. We'll find out the results for next time.
Yes, we will. So, in the meantime, you can do all the usual things by following us, liking videos, tell Mark what a like is, drop him a line, drop him an email, tweet him at Dr.Mark Garnett.
And then wait for the silence, the ensuing...
the deafening silence that will follow.
Yeah.
Great. So, until next time, we've been The Impact Narrative.
Thanks for watching. We still are, but we will be again more visibly. We'll continue being The Impact Narrative, but in private.
Well, it wasn't the snappy ending that I'd envisaged, but I guess it does a job.